Today I'm very happy to have James Sill, who is a AP government teacher here at Hastings High School. James, thanks for joining us today on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So you were telling me earlier before the show that you've been with the Hastings School District for about 21 years?
Right, that's correct. Yeah, I taught for 7 years at the middle school. It was a geography class, and then I've taught 14 years here. I teach world studies for 3 hours of the day and 2 hours of AP Gov.
Great, great. So we'll probably talk a little bit more about AP Gov today, but how have students changed and evolved in their knowledge of politics over the years since the 90s, for example?
Okay, since the 90s. So in my 14 years, I think they're more politically now aware than they were even 10 years ago. I think a lot of it is because of the social media, because so many of them connect either through tweets or Facebook or online chats or things like that. So I've noticed them being a little bit more aware of what's going on with the politicians.
Okay. And I know myself, I get most of my news from Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter. And do you see kids, or I don't want to say kids, but young adults today, are they preferring Twitter and Facebook, or are there other vehicles that they're using?
They're probably preferring Twitter and Facebook. They'll tell me they will watch someone's Twitter feed, or if they're watching a debate, they will follow the tweets from the debate to see how people are reacting to it.
Okay, interesting, interesting. Well, that's great to hear. I know my son is in college, and that's similar to what he's experienced is live tweeting, and you're following a particular personality or particular network and seeing what they have to say about the debate or the campaign. So social media has probably changed the most in the years that you've been teaching. Do you think that it's a good thing to have that much of a real-time? How is it really?
I think for younger people, it reacts to where they're living all the time, right? So they are online, I wouldn't say 24/7, but even this year we changed where they can have their cell phones on during the day at certain points, whereas before they couldn't. So they are used to checking their phones. If you're here during the day in passing period, you'll be walking by somebody and 5 other people will be on their phones. So it's a digital group.
And there's collisions in the hall happening all the time.
Amazingly, it's almost like they have like an internal radar or GPS where it doesn't happen as much as you think it would be, though. Yeah.
Can you set your phone to your next class and Siri tells you where to go?
The latest thing is they'll play a trivia game called Trivia Crack on their way, so you can tell if they're too sucked into the game, they might bounce into somebody next to them. So, yeah.
Well, great. Well, interesting. I've never thought about that before, but so that has changed the dynamic here at the high school.
Oh, just in the last year or two. But amazingly, we've actually had less issues because there's a divide within the building, obviously with any building of should we allow them to have phones or should we not allow them to have phones.
Right.
Historically, we've had a no phone policy during class as well as during the passing period, and we opened that up this year. We're trusting them as young adults to get where they need to be and have the phone on when you need to have it on, because it's obviously you can use tons of Google searches and go to tweets and find out things in live time. And we were able to do that even last week in class. I was having the students do a demographic piece. So we were looking at the Census Bureau, and rather than going to a computer lab, we just all whipped out our phones and we just did it in class.
Wow, great, great. So it's right there, it's real time. If something happens, so for example, there's a mass shooting or there's a certain candidate who says something crazy.
Right, that could happen on a daily basis. Right,
yeah, exactly,
right.
Exactly, great. So you get that right in real time in the classroom.
Right.
That's really fascinating. I know growing up I had a textbook that, I know you still have books and things,
we still have those,
okay.
right. The fun thing is they have online versions of those where they have simulations connected to those. So rather than where you and I would basically sit at home and highlight stuff, now they have interactive things connected to the textbook as well.
Interesting, okay. And then the students are out there, if they have a paper that they're writing, they have the Google,
Google Docs.
Yeah, Google Docs.
The Google Docs, right, yeah, the Google Docs. It goes from Google Docs to turnitin.com is the new thing.
Oh, all right.
So you and I might be working on a project together, and you might do a piece of it, and I might do a piece of it, so we can edit it when you're at work and I'm someplace else, so we can be in 2 different places, which is wonderful. And then they'll upload it to turnitin.com, and then that'll take care of the English plagiarism piece of it.
Right.
And then I can also interact with it right online as well, and then they can get feedback rather quickly.
Interesting, interesting, great. So one of the things I've been wondering, and I've been meaning to ask you here as we've been planning this show, is in an election year, so this
Sure.
is the election season from
Right.
2015 into 16. Do you think students are more politically interested or active when there's a campaign actively
Oh,
going on?
definitely.
Or-
I
okay.
mean, it also, because my class is a senior elective, at least the ones we're talking about today, the AP Gov class, I'll see spikes in how many people actually take the class a year before. So the kids in the high school will have to choose to take the class this year, obviously, and some of them are already looking ahead, and they'll tell me, I wouldn't have taken the class if it wasn't an election year.
Right.
So they're already thinking ahead, like you were using the term, which I know we go between young adults and teenagers, right? They're already thinking ahead to that first vote.
Right.
And they want to be in there because that first vote matters to them.
Okay. So the primary here, or I guess it's a caucus in Minnesota,
Right.
is March 1st, I believe.
Yep.
Okay. And which is fairly early, which is kind of nice to have in Minnesota. And then obviously Iowa caucus is, I think, February 1st. So
Right. We make a big deal about the Iowa one because everyone else does too.
right,
Yeah.
right, and not too long after is Minnesota, so that's great. But then the general election for president, obviously, is November. I believe November, is it 3rd or 4th? That first week of November. So when we get closer, we'll give you the exact date. So these kids are actually looking forward to their first vote. They're 17 now. And that's great to hear that they're actually excited about voting.
Oh, some of them actually went with the school board election because some of them had turned 18 this fall.
Oh,
So at
okay.
least locally, some of them were able to do the school board election. Right?
Great,
So that was nice.
great. Whether it was like, one thing on the ballot or whatever.
And I think 9% of Hastings showed up for that one, or some really small number. Yeah.
Right. So just kind of dovetailing off of that, I know with the presidential election, obviously we perhaps might have a female candidate for president on the ballot. Presidential years tend to be when people get out and vote. Anticipating a big turnout from students as well as adults, just in your experience?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I would say we always compare the off-year election, the congressional elections like 2010, 2018, those kind of elections to the presidential elections, and there's usually about a 10 to 15% spike in Minnesota and nationally. So the kids are more excited about it. In fact, I mean, when you mentioned the congressional elections, some of them are close to the congressional members, but most of them, like the big enchilada of the presidency, is the one they care about.
Right.
Like
right.
most Americans.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So our district here, congressional district, as you know, is going to be an open seat.
Right.
A lot of national attention, a lot of national money pouring into the district. We have a few candidates, I think, on both sides of the aisle at this point. Any initial thoughts on who might be up there with? I know it's very early
Right.
yet, but I know that there's. I don't want to name names because there's so many people
Right.
running, but that's an added twist to.
I don't have any front runners in class. We talked about the choices that people make in regards to with John Kleining deciding to retire. So we usually try to use local examples. For instance, we use the term lame duck. So a lame duck is a person who either chooses to retire, or if it's the 22nd Amendment and you're Obama, you can't run a second time.
Right.
Excuse me, a third time. So we talk about how that would play into our local election. And we also use a vocab term, open elections or open seats. So while the Republicans had this seat as a safe seat for many, many years now they may or may not have to fight for it as we go forward.
Right.
So we talk about some of the implications of that, more so than who's running. Because as you said, it's really early in the game, and a lot of the kids, as well as a lot of the adults, don't know who's going to sort of fall out there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Actually, that's interesting. I was called by a research firm here several months ago about this congressional district race, and called in and was actually paid to give my opinions about the congressional race, and both parties, candidates on both sides of the aisle, without names attached to their bios. So I didn't know who was which party, or
So there's no biases to
There's
a
no
name
bias.
or legacy or anything like that.
exactly. So that was a fascinating experience for me. Never done that before. We got free cookies and pop.
Yeah. That's a pretty good deal.
So, you
you
know-
could get teenagers to work for that, as well as myself. Yeah.
And I got to talk about politics for about an hour with strangers, so that was interesting. So getting back to the 2016 election, as you followed it through this fall in 2015, obviously the story, the elephant, no pun intended, in the middle of the room is Donald Trump.
Sure.
Are children out there, or kids, are they looking at Donald Trump as, hey, it's that guy I know on TV? or what is their recognition level with Mr. Trump?
They're following everything he says, everything from the outlandish to the mundane. We just did an activity called Opinion Schemas, which in essence is a low-level version of what it sounds like they were paying you guys in food to do. Or what you do is you take a candidate and literally you just write down exactly what you think of them, praiseworthy things, critiques, any information, etc. So it was interesting because about a third of the class chose to do Trump. So you would ask your neighbor and they would fill out one and you would fill out one, and the idea is then we'd come back almost like a little focus group, but it's a focus group in my little room, and we would say, okay, what would this mean for a candidate? Right? So we had everything on there. One young man wrote down, these are his outlandish statements, and that's how the young man put it. He's a 17-year-old, and he literally rattled off in quotes 6 things that he found rather outlandish that Trump has said. And then you have his hair making almost every one of them, both on the pro and the con, which I found was interesting.
Okay.
Right? And some of them have very valid concerns over security. And I'd say the biggest thing you've seen on every one of them is they mention the fact that he's a private businessman. So when you talk about the pros and the cons, they always mention the private businessman angle and how he's made money on his own in the private sector.
Sure, okay. And then that is an attribute that he would bring to the White House, that he knows the business and he understands. Okay. Any other candidates kind of piquing the interest and curiosity of students out there?
What's interesting is it almost seems to mirror on Minnesota, where you see Bernie Sanders sort of, I guess I'd say, catching some kind of fever on these college campuses. You're also seeing it locally, or at least in my little room of 40 students over 2 or 3 hours, where when they were given a choice to pick whoever they wanted to do, the next most popular person was Bernie Sanders.
All right, interesting.
And a lot of it speaks to some of the issues he's talking to the young generation about, whether it be free or reduced college costs. That's one of the things they're concerned about. They're also concerned about health care and how Obamacare may or may not play out over the next few years.
Okay.
You know, obviously that's a firebrand kind of issue. Some people love it and some people hate it. More of my students are looking at how are they going to pay for those kind of things down the line.
Sure.
At least on the Bernie Sanders angle.
Exactly, exactly. And that's interesting with Mr. Sanders, or Senator Sanders. His appeal, I think, is to the youth and is to people that are looking for a fundamental change in how government happens. Mr. Trump's, I think, supporters are more interested in something is wrong and we need to change it, we need to clean house, or something is... So both ends of the spectrum looking for drastic changes.
Right. It depends how you get there. In fact, we had a debate this morning because I don't know when this is going to air, but the outlandish statement or not outlandish statement, depending how you see it, Mr. Trump had just mentioned possibly more security issues in regards to Muslim Americans. So that was the statement that came out right before we aired this or talked about this.
Right.
So the students came in, of course, wanting to talk about that. And we talked about how that might play out politically, right, both here and with his base. Right. So it was an interesting discussion on how that would play out in a primary season among regular Republican voters and how would it play out in a general election, because those are two different sets of people you have to make happy.
Right, exactly. And one of the things we've discussed on this show a number of times before is the Trump's appeal to, right now he's obviously leading in many of the polls. Again, by the time this airs it may have changed, but we're anticipating he's probably going to be at least in the top tier of the candidates. What do you attribute his success to nationally?
Just, I guess I look at it in 3 different ways, also from my own personal opinion and what I see from the students. Right? What I see from the students when they're writing up these opinion schemas, because it's sort of an interesting window into their world, they love the fact that he will say whatever he wants, no holds barred, and it's like an honest kind of purity to that. So I think a lot of Americans like the idea that it's not the typical politician, right? He doesn't pull his punches, as it were, right? Now, obviously, the flip side of that is sometimes people say that's outlandish. Right? The other thing that both the students and some of their parents had filled these out said that business piece is something that we need to bring to government, because they're worried about debt, they're worried about where the national economy is, and they think someone who can run a business on a multinational kind of level, which he talks about, maybe he can bring that to USA Incorporated, if you would.
Right.
My personal opinion, looking at it over 20 years or so, is the fact that people are upset with gridlock and the fact that people are upset with Washington in general. It seems like they're always arguing about stuff. He seems like someone who says he can cut through that. Now, whether that happens or not, I guess I'm old enough to find out over the last few years that everyone comes to Washington saying they have a fix, but it's harder to do than we say.
Exactly.
I think we found that locally over a decade ago when we had Jesse Ventura, who was an independent, And then, of course, then he still has to work with both sides.
Right, right. And when you're an independent, you don't have that caucus behind you supporting your policies. It is very difficult as an independent. And that's one of the things that has come up here lately with the Republican Party infrastructure, objecting strongly in some ways to some of Mr. Trump's latest statements, at least. I think one of them was probably the most notable is banning any Muslim from entering the United States entirely.
Right, that was the one that we were alluding to this morning, right.
Yeah.
And I can understand from the Republican establishment perspective that might be a problem for them in the general election because of some of his other statements down the line. So it's going to be interesting to see how that one plays out.
Sure. Do you think ultimately if let's say the Republican Party kind of nudges him to the side or marginalizes him, or there's another candidate that comes up that the party will get behind or support, the money supports that person? You know, Trump has already said, well, possibly I'll go independent.
Right.
What would happen if there's a third party? I know we had that in 1992 with Ross Perot.
Ross Perot, I think, is a great analogy because he also is a guy with a lot of dollars behind him, and he sort of upset the apple cart. I mean, we look at that one historically as, when you look at the data, like talking about polling, most people, when they asked what was their second choice beyond Perot was Bush Sr. So most people look at that historically as that upset the apple cart and probably threw the election to Clinton. Right now, it's probably a little bit early to see if Trump would do that, where those supporters would go. Would he pull more from the Republican side? My best guess at this point, a year out, would probably be he'd probably upset more from the Republican side than from the Democratic side. And I think the biggest thing that Trump has going for him, he's the anti-establishment candidate. And he would still have that if he ran as an independent, because he'd be the ultimate anti-establishment candidate.
Exactly.
With lots of zeros behind his name, so he can write his own checks.
And he'd be on television.
Yes, he'd be on television. Yes.
The guy likes to be on TV,
right.
let's face it.
Like we are right now in Hastings. Right?
Exactly, right.
Exactly.
Not quite as big of an audience as the Donald, but we're trying, we're hoping.
Right.
On YouTube, at least, we have an international audience.
There we go.
Let's put it that way.
We have different budgets, too. Right?
Exactly, right. He would probably have a golden, background here or something. I don't know. So your best guess as far as the Democratic side, do you think Senator Sanders has a chance? I know Governor O'Malley, Martin O'Malley, is also running against Hillary, but Hillary Clinton has to be the presumptive nominee at this point.
I would agree with that. I think Mr. O'Malley, I've seen him on Comedy Central and some other venues, and I think he comes across as a very strong candidate, but he has not gained any traction early on. And I think if he hasn't at this point, what typically happens is then the money, the super PAC money and the other stuff doesn't come to you.
Sure.
So I think it's going to be a two-horse race coming out of Iowa between Sanders and Hillary. And if Hillary puts him away early in the first two states, it'll be a coronation.
Right.
I mean, she's the establishment candidate. It's interesting, even the kids, their one caveat with Mr. Sanders is on almost every one of those sheets, they're worried about his age. And that might be an 18-year-old looking at an older person.
A 74-year-old.
A 74-year-old, right. So we used the example of Mr. McCain in the last election, 2 election cycles back, and how he's still vibrant and doing his job in the Senate. But that was the very same concern way back when with Mr. McCain.
And Senator McCain is running for re-election this year in Arizona. And I'd be very surprised, having been a former Arizonan, I'd be very surprised if McCain would lose.
Oh, I would as well.
At this point, right.
He seems to be very vibrant and doing his job, right?
Exactly. And he's the also an individual who's been targeted by Mr. Trump.
Yes.
for getting caught as a veteran was interesting. So
to me, as a child of a father who fought in World War II, that was one of the more surprising statements in the sense that usually you say, well, what would hurt a candidate? That seems to be one of them that would hurt a candidate, but he's wrote out a lot of these statements.
On the Democratic side again, Secretary Clinton. Do you think that being married to the former president, Bill Clinton, who had by all margins, had a relatively successful presidency, there was that impeachment matter that came along, which was probably politically motivated, I guess you would be fair to say that. Do you think that's a liability to have Bill running with you, or is he going to bring up more of the Monica stuff, or is it going to be, this is Hillary's show, I don't think Bill can help himself. He just loves it so much.
It's in his DNA.
Right.
I mean, they talk about a policy wonk. He would talk politics all the time.
Yeah.
I guess my personal sense of it is, one, looking at the kids' sheets, because we talked about Hillary as well, the two things they look at is that, and I think this is a generational change, there are a number of them who are upset that she stayed with him after the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Where a decade ago there was more, to use the old line, stand by your man kind of.
Right.
There was this, hey, you stood by your man and you put your marriage back together. For the group that I'm reading in the last 2 years, they seem to be more upset about the scandal, whether it was politically motivated or not. Obviously, some of it was his own doing, clearly. But the fact that she didn't leave him, for this age group, it seems like that shows a weakness. At least that's what they're seeing. Right? And I guess I'd say the biggest thing as a middle-aged guy from this is I think some people just have legacy fatigue, and we talk about that a little bit in class, where you have the Bush legacy and you also have the Clinton legacy. I think that's hurting Jeb on the right, and definitely hurting Hillary on the left, in the sense it's almost like she's ordained to be the nominee, and some people just push back at that. And I think that helps Sanders in the sense that he's not Hillary.
Any guesses on, other than the Donald, who might be the nominee on the Republican side if he exits or is otherwise goes way too far and leaves the race?
What I think will be interesting is after Iowa and New Hampshire, because obviously there'll be a shaking out of things. Right now, I think on the Republican field, you have the angst people as the people who are upset about Republicans and Democrats in Washington in general, and they seem to be going for either Ben Carson or right now Trump. And I think that's why they're leading in the polls for the most part. But once some of the other, quote, establishment candidates drop out, and you only have one or two of them to choose from, I think it's going to be like the Rubios of the world that tend to play more to the moderate middle, and they can also bring in a more diverse group to the Republican electorate. I just don't know how that's going to shake out in January. I mean, if we had a crystal ball, we probably wouldn't be here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Ted Cruz, I know, has been making some moves toward the top of the ticket. Any thoughts on Ted Cruz, that he might?
I think Ted Cruz does an amazing job of being an insider-outsider, in the sense that he tends to be, at least from some of his comments, at least lately, he tends to be a little bit more radical, but also play to the same people that Carson and Trump does. And it's surprising because since he's in Congress, he can play both sides to the middle. I don't know how that would play as we go forward, though.
Right.
When they're looking for more of a who can beat Hillary, or who could beat Bernie, or who could beat Malley, as we go forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, James, I really appreciate you being on the show today, and
thank you.
well, I definitely love to have you back as we get a little bit closer to the general election, if you'd like to come back.
That'd be wonderful, yeah.
And hear what the kids next fall say about the upcoming election. So thanks again.
Oh, you're welcome.
You have a little Marco Rubio here. Well, today I'd like to talk a little bit about fear, and there's certainly a lot of it going around nowadays. It seems like every time you see the news, there's a report of another terrorist attack, mass shooting, or both, in a foreign country or even right here in America. Lately, it seems hard to keep track of the reasons why our flags are even flying at half-staff. So it's natural that we're all a bit nervous that something might happen to us or someone we know. Now, since the beginning of time, fear has been a great motivator. Sometimes just the mere hint of a pending invasion by another country was enough to make nations surrender. Leaders know that the scarier they make something appear, they can get their citizens to respond in ways that often seem irrational. Now, during the Cold War, as America and the Soviet Union faced each other down in Europe and built stockpiles of nuclear weapons, all of us lived in fear of an all-out nuclear war. They called it mutually assured destruction, or MAD, and it worked incredibly well. Just search YouTube sometime for examples of films like Duck and Cover, which were shown to young school children convinced that their classroom desk could save them from a Soviet ICBM. In the 1980s, at the height of the Reagan era, I went to high school in Omaha, Nebraska, not too far away from Strategic Air Command, otherwise known as Ground Zero USA, because there were so many Soviet missiles aimed at it. In fact, Strategic Air Command always kept a plane flying in the air above Omaha with a general who held the launch codes for an all-out attack on Russia. In our personal lives, fear often governs much of what we do. We put up fences around our homes, we buy extra padlocks and alarm systems, and avoid certain parts of town after dark. And in the great American tradition, if owning one gun is good, owning two must be even better, right? So it's not surprising that some individuals running for political office through the years have used fear in order to rally people behind their cause. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson suggested that Republican Senator Barry Goldwater was eager to use nuclear weapons against North Vietnam. And in 1984, Democrat Walter Mondale ran a TV spot against President Reagan, saying that the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, would actually lead to an escalation in the nuclear arms race. And not to be left out, the Republicans have certainly used fear in their campaigns. In 1988, George Bush painted Democrat Michael Dukakis as soft on crime and aired the famous Willie Horton ad, featuring a man who committed a rape while he was furloughed from prison in Massachusetts. The implication was that if Dukakis were elected, the gates of America's prisons would somehow swing open on Inauguration Day, allowing hardened criminals to roam the streets. Most recently on the Republican side, fear has been the preferred campaign weapon of choice for billionaire and professional talker Donald Trump. First, Trump warned us about the rapist Mexicans coming to steal our jobs, and then it was women in the news media, then it was Senator John McCain, and then he mocked disabled people, and then it was immigrants from everywhere. He has encouraged fans to rough up Latinos and African Americans at his rallies, and now he wants to ban all Muslims from entering the United States, even if they're citizens or returning from serving abroad in our armed forces. And why do glorified carnival barkers like Trump use fear when running for such an important office? Because it works, pure and simple. But as long as we understand what it is and recognize when it's being used, we don't have to stand for it. It's time for all of us, Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike, to find leaders who can motivate us through optimism and positive ideas for our country, rather than seeking to divide us. There's no reason it can't happen if we want it to. We'll see you next time on Everybody Loves Politics.